Hi everyone, thanks a lot for tuning in. I really appreciate David Hollands and Andrew Thorndyke helping me with this video and the last one, and I hope you enjoyed them and we all continue to learn together. During the last lecture, we discussed Robert Nozick, the great libertarian thinker of the 20th century, who essentially argued for a minimal state where very few, if any, goods were redistributed from the wealthy to the poor. Robert Nozick was inspired by his friend and colleague at Harvard University, John Rawls, who was responsible for producing the most influential political philosophy in analytic thought during the 20th century. Now, there's a lot of dimensions to Rawls' thought, and we're not going to be able to discuss them all here. So we're primarily going to be focusing on the two principles of justice that he derived, and some facts about how it is that he went about reasoning to get to them. And we'll be looking a little bit at the influence that he had as well. But we're not going to be talking a lot about his seminal work in things like liberal pluralism or international law, because we'll have to save those for later lectures. So just by way of background, Rawls was born in 1921 and died in 2002. Now the facts of his life aren't really all that germane to his political philosophy, with about one or two exceptions that I'll discuss very briefly. For the most part, he lived out his life as a teacher at Harvard University, who was widely known for being among the most modest and self-effacing human beings alive. He very rarely gave interviews even after he became world famous. He was known to be deeply nice and extremely gracious to the people who criticized them, often thanking them for providing rebuttals or commentary on his work. But there are some important facts about his life that are worth keeping in mind. So when Rawls was very young, his sibling contracted a very dangerous disease from him and subsequently died. This had a profound impact on Rawls' thinking as he realized that a lot of chance was involved in who ends up dying and who doesn't. This was further reinforced when Rawls decided to leave the priesthood and participate in the Second World War as an infantryman in the Pacific Island. He saw a lot of friends die there, and he also noticed that a lot of the religious affiliates who were involved in blessing the Americans and telling them that their cause was right seemed to ignore the fact that many of the Japanese soldiers who were fighting against them might very well not have wanted to be there, and were just as human and therefore just as prone to suffering as the Americans. This gave him a sense, if you want, of how much of a role luck does play in our lives, and how morally arbitrary the circumstances of our conditions happen to be. So after fighting in the Second World War as an infantryman, Rawls acquired his Ph.D. and went and learned under the great legal philosopher H.L.A. Hart at Oxford University, before getting a few teaching gigs here and there, and finally winding up at Harvard University, where he spent the rest of his academic career. Now, unlike a lot of academics and philosophers who are famous for numerous articles and books, John Rawls will really only be remembered firmly but intensely for one book, A Theory of Justice, which he published in 1971, and which, in the words of some, reinvigorated the whole study of political philosophy in the analytical world. So what's A Theory of Justice about? Well, in it, Rawls states that his objection is to what was then the predominant philosophy in the analytical world, which was utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, stated very simply, is what you should do is try to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people across the board in society. Rawls was deeply influenced by utilitarianism, and he certainly admired a great number of utilitarian thinkers, most notably Sidgwick and Mills. But he was deeply concerned that utilitarianism didn't take seriously enough, as he put it, the difference between people, and how so many of us actually want to make something of our lives personally, without necessarily needing to sacrifice unduly for the benefit of others without getting something back. Rawls was in a way attracted to this idea that individuals are concerned to make something of their lives. But at the same time, as mentioned before, his early experiences had influenced him to think that a lot of what we experience in life is bound up in luck, fortune, and misfortune, and therefore aren't really morally relevant when we're trying to consider what is just and what is unjust. And a lot of these concerns tend to permeate the book and influence its flavor and texture. So what is A Theory of Justice about? A Theory of Justice is a bit of a difficult book to read. It's not really all that poorly written, so much as there are a lot of interlocking sections to it, all of which build together into a kind of single argument. And a lot of the text testifies to the fact that Rawls presented the argument first in a lot of different papers. It's not as cleanly written a book as some others. Nonetheless, it's absolutely brilliant and extremely intoxicating in some ways, as you start to realize that this was a person who really had a systematic argument in mind, and was trying to convince you that you should accept this whole package of what he eventually called justice as fairness, rather than just parts and parcels of different types of arguments for different types of moral principles. So what is it that Rawls argued fundamentally? Well, he starts off his book, again, by criticizing the then dominant utilitarian conception and contrasting it with a kind of Kantian constructivism, which he took as the appropriate meta-ethical stance for constructing any political theory. Now, meta-ethics is a big word, but essentially what it just means is that he felt that people were in some senses responsible for choosing the moral principles by which they were governed. In this sense, he doesn't think that morality is some objective thing that we find out there in the world, or rather like the utilitarians, that it's some objective calculation that we just have to accept as necessarily the right way to go. To a certain extent, we are capable of deciding the principles that we wish to be governed by. And our responsibility, in a sense, is to make sure that those principles are applied as fairly and as impartially across society as possible. So how is it that we can decide what principles to be governed by, and how can we determine whether or not they're being applied fairly and impartially? This is where one of Rawls's great innovations comes in. He develops this thought experiment called the original position, that's meant to carry the old idea of the social contract to what he calls a higher level of abstraction that kind of dissociates it from some of the historical prejudices with which it's commonly associated. So the idea that there never really has been a social contract, or that this idea of a social contract is just a myth. Rawls fully accepts that. There has never been such a thing as a real social contract, whether in the United States or Canada or any other Western country. But his idea is that the idea of the social contract, framed the right way within the original position thought experiment, can teach us a lot about political obligation and the principles of justice that should govern a righteous society. The original position is meant to capture, in a sense, certain Kantian ideas, again, about choosing the principles we wish to be governed by, but giving them a bit more of an empirical twist, and one that's focused on our interest rather than some kind of objective idea of the moral law. So, to put it really simply, Rawls asks us to think about what principles of justice we would choose if we were truly reasonable and rational. Now, how can we assume that? He says, well, we can't make these kind of assumptions about individuals as they actually exist in the world. As we actually exist in the world, we're bound up in all kinds of prejudices, preferences, and histories that lead us to reason in a way that's deeply biased. So, if I happen to be a really rich person, I might want greater tax cuts for the rich, and find some ideological system that will justify that. Or if I'm really poor, I want the rich to redistribute a great deal of their wealth to help me out. And I might develop an ideological set of principles that will help me justify that. And the same is true throughout all the different biases that we know operate in life. So what Rawls does to try to counteract that is suggest, imagine you have a set of reasoners who know a great deal about economic theory, are basically moral, are both reasonable and rational, so that is, they are self-interested, but they also have a certain capacity to recognize that other people are also self-interested and have a right to pursue their interests. And they know certain basic tenets about economic theory, political theory, and other important details about how it is that you could order a society. But none of these individual reasoners know anything about themselves at all. They don't know what their gender is, their sexual orientation, their class situatedness, religion, absolutely nothing. So Rawls says we have this set of reasoners who have a great deal of information and intelligence available to them, but they aren't bound up with the same kind of prejudices and biases that most of us are, because they ultimately don't know what their prejudices and biases actually are. So Rawls calls this situation where there are impartial reasoners who don't know any specific details about themselves, but know a great deal about the details necessary for ordering a society, as a veil of ignorance. So this veil cuts people off from who they're going to be in the real world after they make a decision using the information that's available to them about the best principles of justice that they think should order a society. What these people are essentially doing are reasoning together as a cooperative about the kind of principles they want to organize a society, and then they will step out of this veil of ignorance and establish these as the principles that are going to govern them henceforth. And Rawls thinks that this is the best way to go about engaging in abstract political reasoning because it doesn't involve ourselves in any of these kind of biases. It's fundamentally a very fair way of thinking about things, to his mind. So what principles would we choose if we were behind a veil of ignorance in the original position as an impartial reasoner? Well, Rawls thinks that we would debate a couple of alternatives, and we would ultimately move towards two principles of justice, as he puts it, that are lexically ordered, which means that the one takes precedence over the other. The first principle of justice is that each person would be entitled to the same set of basic liberties. Now, what does this mean? It means essentially that we'd all be entitled to the same set of standard liberal rights. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom to live our lives, if you want, as we see fit. And Rawls argues that we would choose this principle because behind a veil of ignorance, none of us would know what kind of lifestyle we would embrace after we step outside the veil. And we wouldn't want to take the chance that we would happen to lead some kind of lifestyle that would be penalized by others, fundamentally. Because most people in society happen to be prejudicial towards Muslims, or happen to think that blacks are an inferior race. We wouldn't want any of that, and we would be unwilling to take that risk. Now, this principle is comparatively uncontroversial, mainly because many states these days at least nominally embrace the standard package of liberal rights that Rawls argues for. Interestingly enough, it was his teacher, H.L.A. Hart, who probably gave the most sustained objections to this first principle, arguing that Rawls doesn't really have a good way of balancing between competing rights, say between rights to religion and rights to safety. So I might practice certain religious tropes that might endanger other people. How far should we be able to take that? Etc., etc., etc. So Rawls' second principle is divided into two parts. And he reversed the order of these two parts throughout his life, mainly saying this was a stylistic change. The first part of the second principle is that social offices should be open to all, regardless of one's personal characteristics. Now, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. But what it essentially means is that people shouldn't be restricted from having certain positions because of their sexual orientation, their race, their gender, etc., etc., etc. Now, the second part of this principle, though, is by far the most controversial. And it's probably because it's the most deeply radical component of Rawls' thought. In fact, in some respects, this is one of the most radical arguments one has ever seen in political philosophy. And it's that economic inequalities in society are in no way justifiable unless they are to the benefit of the least well-off. What this essentially means is that when you're trying to assess what is economically just in a society, the person who you always need to ask isn't the rich person or even the middle class, as we see in a lot of the rhetoric in liberal democracies these days. It's the person who is least well off in that society that matters, and whose voice counts for the most. Now, Rawls develops a lot of arguments for this difference principle, as it's sometimes called. It's also known as the max-min principle at other points. But we're going to focus on just a few of them here, because a lot of pressure has been put on this, both by social conservatives who argue for different conceptions, more inegalitarian conceptions particularly, of economic justice, and to some extent also from the Marxist left, which wants something that's a little bit more radically egalitarian. Most people who argue for less egalitarian distributions of economic resources tend to make several different arguments. The most common one is the meritocratic argument. What is the meritocratic argument? It's essentially a variation of what you might call liberal liberty. That absolutely Rawls is correct, that people shouldn't be dissuaded or prevented from pursuing offices or objectives just on the basis of things like their race, sexual orientation, gender, etc., etc. These opportunities should be available to all. But the natural talents and drive of these individuals will mean that ultimately some will wind up better off than others, because they might be more intelligent, because they might work harder, because they might be faster or better basketball players, to use Nozick's example, for instance. But Rawls rejects all this. Now, one of his arguments is essentially that behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, most of us would be unwilling to gamble that we might end up being the poorest individuals in society. And what he'll point to is something like the contemporary United States, where there's a very small chance that you might end up being Bill Gates or a member of the Hilton family, but a fairly decent chance that you might end up being a single mother living in the Bronx, or living in Compton for that matter. And he said, given those odds, very few of us in the original position would take the risk that we'd end up being a millionaire, when there's a far better chance that we might end up being that single mother trying to make it, without any access to decent healthcare, decent education for your children, or really a lot of life options. That's one argument. But his deeper and more interesting argument, and the one that has had profound impact on political theory more generally, is what he calls the argument for moral arbitrariness. And this argument has been absolutely devastating to most meritocratic arguments for the distribution of economic resources. Again, what you might call the liberal way of looking at things. Now, it's a very deep and very interesting argument, so we're going to have to spend a little bit of time on it to explain it properly. The argument for moral arbitrariness has two dimensions. One is directed against what you might call the social benefits that people might accrue as a result of the context within which they grew up. But the other and more deep argument, again, is against what he calls the idea that natural talent should determine economic status. So the first one, again, is what you might call a social democratic argument against wealth accumulation on the basis of pre-existing economic inequality. What does this mean? So here, Rawls will argue, again, following a lot of social democratic models, that many people wind up being better off because they enjoyed certain advantages over the course of their life that flowed from circumstances that they were in no way morally responsible for. So this can be things like the fact that they had wealthy parents, or they had parents who were really willing to encourage them to pursue an education. It might be things like the fact that schools just happen to be better in some places. It might be something like they happen to be born into the right race or the right religion. All these things play a massive role in determining how successful one is going to be in life. And again, Rawls' argument is that the people who might wind up being successful as a result of this in no way can be said to have ultimately deserved this success in the strong sense of the word, because they enjoyed so many advantages over the course of their upbringing that were denied to other people. Now, this doesn't mean he's trying to be malicious and saying that these people are bad. It's just that they shouldn't claim that they are ultimately deserving of all the goods that they've received, when so many of them have accumulated on this basis. I don't think that many of us would deny this instance of Rawls' argument, because it seems fairly commonsensical these days. There's just really no denying that if you happen to be born in a wealthy family, or in the right country, or for that matter in many places, as a member of the right race, you might end up enjoying certain advantages that would be denied to others for, again, purely morally arbitrary reasons. And this strongly implies for Rawls that the only way for a society to be fair is to redistribute wealth earned through some of these undeserved practices back to the people who wind up the least well off. But his second and more powerful argument is directed against what he calls the natural talents, and the argument for a meritocratic conception that flows from them. So some people will argue, well, that's fine. We accept the idea that social contexts tend to determine a great deal of successes that people will enjoy over the course of their life. And maybe we should redistribute some of the goods that accrue from those to those who are least well off because they are undeserved. But what about natural talents? If people are like, say, Wilt Chamberlain, very gifted at basketball, or highly intelligent, or more aesthetically pleasing to most people, or just have more willpower, they're willing to put in those extra hours at the office, go that extra mile if you want. Shouldn't those people deserve some of the extra goods that will flow to them as a result of their natural talents, whether it be intelligence, looks, willpower, athletic ability, etc., etc.? And Rawls' argument, again, very profoundly, and again in a certain disturbing way, is no. They don't, because natural talents are distributed in a way that is also morally arbitrary. And to do this, he points to intelligence as a good example. Now, most of us aren't born at doing anything to determine our intelligence. We were born smart, we're born less smart, whatever it happens to be. And the same is true, Rawls thinks, of a great deal of other things. People aren't doing anything to become more or less attractive. Many people are just born handsome or beautiful or not. And he thinks the same is true even of something like willpower. We know now that willpower is in no small sense determined by a great deal of things that are morally arbitrary. Many of them the social factors that we talked about before. Having the right parents, getting the right education, having some kind of people who are going to instill drive in you. A lot of that can determine whether you're a willful person or not. So Rawls thinks that natural talents like these shouldn't determine the distribution of goods in our society, and that a meritocratic conception of economic distribution based on them is fundamentally unjust. Which again speaks to his argument for why it is that good should always be directed towards the worst well-off in our societies. Now, again, this doesn't mean that Rawls thinks that all inequalities in our society are unjustified. He does think that the reason why we shouldn't just have a flat egalitarian system so everyone gets the same is because incentive structures need to exist to encourage people to work harder, to labor more, produce more goods. There's a bit of a utilitarian dimension to his thought here, drawing to some extent from classical economic theory. But again, the inequalities that flow from this aren't deserved by the people who happen to benefit from them. His argument is these people are entitled to enjoying the unequal fruits of their labor because those labors are to the benefit of the least well off. They warrant them because it produces more goods in an economically vibrant society that will ultimately benefit all, but especially benefit the least well off. In many ways, I see this as the most profoundly egalitarian argument that one can conceive of. If you compare it to even something like Marxist conception of the distribution of goods, it comes up a little bit ahead if you are looking for a truly egalitarian approach to the distribution of goods. Marx argues that the distribution of goods in our societies is unjust. He never actually uses that word, but I think it's implied in a lot of his work, because the people who commit the most time and energy to producing goods have those goods taken from them by a capitalist class that is fundamentally intent on exploiting them for its own benefit. Now, there's a lot of good things to say about Marx, and we might talk about him in another lecture, but the idea underpinning this, again, is essentially the same as what you find in other classical labor theories of value, that the amount of energy that you and labor power that you put into something determines your ownership of it. Rawls will have none of that. His argument is that labor power and the investment of labor and energy and willpower into something should in no way determine who gets something. Because ultimately, your capacity to labor and your willpower is determined by morally arbitrary circumstances. This just goes to show you how deep Rawls' egalitarianism goes. He's intent on essentially saying that most of the inequalities in our world that we see, whether they're derived from social attributes or natural talents, are undeserved. We should take very little pride in them. We should claim very little credit for them. We should be doing what we do to try to benefit the least well off, because that's what is necessary in order to create a more fair society that's in line with the fundamental principles of justice we would choose if we were being truly impartial, rather than blinded, if you want, by our biases, prejudices, and the natural conceits that all of us have that in some ways we are special and responsible for our own destinies. Now, in some ways, this might seem like a bit of an uninspiring, not to mention even a little bit of a weird vision, especially for a liberal thinker like Rawls. This is because, while Rawls argues that we should enjoy, according to the first principle, a broad set of basic liberties that are fundamentally related to our autonomy and ability to choose our life plans, the second principle and his arguments for it seem to imply that most of the circumstances in our life, including a lot of the benefits that we accrue and the actions that we take, are determined by morally arbitrary circumstances. Even something like our willpower and our talents aren't really the result of choices that we make, but circumstances beyond our control. And this means that a lot of the benefits that we accrue from them, whether those are just plain material resources or things like money, not to mention honors, dignities, we can't really take credit for them or claim in any strong sense that we deserve them. But I think it's worth interpreting Rawls rather like a Spinozist. Now, Spinoza was a famous 17th century philosopher who used to argue that the greatest freedom comes from recognizing that fundamentally there's a great deal in our life, that perhaps all, that we don't control. And dealing with that fact with grace, dignity, and a great deal of charity towards our fellow human beings. All of us like to look out at the world and to some extent feel that we are special and above it. And it's very tempting to want to blame other people who might demand something from us for their circumstances and to say that they are responsible for them and therefore I have no obligation to try to help them out. I should only look after myself because, after all, I am responsible for my own destiny as everyone is. Rawls does a great deal to sway us away from this conceit. He suggests that actually, yeah, it's true that there's a lot in our lives that we can't control. But we'd be better off not to mention more moral, and more abiding of the principles of justice we would have chosen under impartial circumstances if we recognize this and try to work together to create a society that is oriented around the two principles of justice, that is more fundamentally respectful of the rights of all other individuals, and that includes their economic rights and the entitlement of the worst well off in our society to enjoy a standard of living that's conducive to what they ultimately deserve, which is in many senses the same as all the rest of us. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again.